The moment everyone called a healing reunion may have actually been the final piece of a story that was quietly falling apart for years, because what looked like forgiveness on the surface suddenly started to look like strategy underneath, and one name, buried, mocked, and dismissed, has now come roaring back into the center of it all: Samantha Markle.
For years now, folks, we've been fed this shiny, polished-up fairy tale about how my half-sister Meghan waltzed into royal life like some kind of scripted rom-com.
Archie was allegedly born, that he said that she had picked up her frozen eggs. So I thought, well, it kind of makes sense, all things taken together, that there would be a surrogate involved.
King Charles sitting in the same room as Archie and Lilith after 4 years of silence should have felt simple, emotional, human, but nothing about this story has ever stayed simple for long. No photographs, no William, no spontaneous warmth captured for the world to see. Just a controlled confirmation and a carefully worded silence that somehow said more than any image ever could. And right there, hidden in that silence, sits the question nobody asked loudly enough: why now? Why, after years of distance, tension, and public fractures, did this suddenly happen? Because someone had already described it. Not vaguely, not emotionally, precisely Samantha Markle. And the moment you start tracing her words backwards, something uncomfortable begins to take shape. Patterns, timelines, decisions that suddenly stop looking random and start looking constructed. The kind of construction that only works as long as nobody steps back far enough to see the full design. Wind back to Windsor Castle, May 2018. The image that launched everything. One woman walking alone, Doria Ragland, calm, composed, perfectly framed.
I would just say that there is so much water under the bridge and so much has spun out of control that was never intended to. And, I think everybody was hurt.
That image wasn't just a moment, it was a foundation. It built a shield so effective that for years, nobody could question it without immediately being pushed into dangerous territory. Because questioning Meghan meant questioning Doria, and questioning Doria meant stepping into something the public instinctively resisted. It was brilliant, untouchable, and almost too perfect, because perfection always hides something. For years, every detail was managed, every appearance controlled, every narrative reinforced. The quiet mother, the steady presence, the emotional core, a version of Doria that felt so complete, so polished that nobody stopped to ask what wasn't being shown. And that's where Samantha Markle entered, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently.
I'm not taking it personally, nor am I holding that against her.
I think a lot of people would take that very personally. You're a member of the family. How hurt have you and the other members of the family been?
She didn't scream into the void. She pointed. Dates, gaps, specific inconsistencies that didn't match the story being sold. But instead of engaging with what she was actually saying, the narrative flipped instantly. Bitter half-sister. Irrelevant, a label so effective it erased the need to listen. And that's where the real shift happened. Because once the messenger is dismissed, the message disappears without ever being tested. But the details she kept returning to didn't disappear. They sat there, waiting. Thomas Markle raising Meghan during the years that shape identity, funding education, supporting early career steps, a presence that didn't align with the simplified version of events being presented globally. And Doria's role, far more complex than the single narrative allowed, was quietly pushed into a version that felt emotionally satisfying but structurally incomplete. And Samantha Markle didn't stop.
Family have received invites, nor have Doria's family. So although we don't understand, we can only wish them well, but I'm not taking it personally, nor am I holding that against her.
Same points, same contradictions, over and over again. That kind of repetition isn't noise, it's pressure. And pressure doesn't disappear, it builds. Then something happened that nobody expected, because nobody was looking. In 2022, Doria Ragland, publicly known as a yoga teacher and social worker, quietly stepped into 3 corporate roles at once: CEO, CFO, secretary, a Delaware registered company tied directly to Meghan. No announcement, no explanation, just a legal structure sitting in plain sight. And suddenly, the image started to crack. Because the woman presented as distant from commerce, untouched by ambition, was now positioned at the very center of a corporate framework designed for control, protection, and financial precision. Delaware is not accidental. It's deliberate, strategic, calculated, and yet, at the exact same time, the public was shown something completely different: a jar of strawberry jam. The first one, gifted to Doria. Warm, personal, symbolic, two completely different realities running side by side. One emotional, one structural. And the distance between them, that's where the story lives. Samantha Markle had been pointing directly at that gap for years. Not the surface, not the emotion, the structure underneath it. And still, nobody connected it because the machine moved faster than the questions. Then came the collapse.
I think that Doria's got more control of Meghan than Harry, that's for sure. I think there's something going on there. Two peas in a pod, I'd say.
Spotify gone. One season. Finished. Netflix canceling projects before they even reached the audience. Deals that were supposed to prove independence suddenly collapsing under scrutiny. The empire that was supposed to stand on its own started to shake. And inside that pressure, something shifted again. Doria moved in. Not temporarily. Not quietly. Fully and suddenly, the woman who had always been presented as the emotional anchor became something else entirely the operational center of a household under strain. A presence described not just as supportive, but essential. But here's where it turns, because after months of being that central figure, something broke. Not publicly, not dramatically. Privately, exhaustion, friction, a dynamic that no longer held. And then, just like that, she left. No statement, no explanation, no reaction from the same machine that had responded aggressively to far smaller issues. Silence. And silence in this story has never meant nothing. It means everything. Because the same system that filed hundreds of complaints over a single broadcast said absolutely nothing when one of its most important figures walked out the door. And then the silence started speaking louder than anything that had come before. Because what happened next didn't just feel like another chapter, it felt like confirmation that everything leading up to it had been building towards something the public was never meant to fully see. The machine that could mobilize instantly, that could flood complaints, trigger apologies, and dominate headlines when it needed to, suddenly chose stillness when the stakes appeared far higher. That contrast alone should have been enough to raise alarms, but instead it slipped through, unnoticed, unchallenged, just another quiet shift in a story already full of them. The departure of Doria Ragland wasn't framed, wasn't explained, wasn't even acknowledged in the way smaller controversies had been. That absence wasn't accidental. It sat there unanswered while everything else continued moving as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, and the signals were no longer hidden behind private walls. They were sitting in public spaces, waiting to be read correctly. Social media posts that should have included Doria Ragland didn't. Moments designed to celebrate family quietly excluded the one person who had been presented as central to everything. And in a system where every detail is managed, every image approved, every word selected with precision, absence becomes a statement. At the same time, language started to shift. Small words, subtle choices, descriptions that sounded harmless until they were placed against the larger narrative. Doria Ragland described not as the grounding force, not as the emotional anchor, but as a free spirit. It sounds warm on the surface, but in a carefully constructed identity built around stability, intention, and control, that label creates distance. It repositions. It separates. And when that separation appears alongside physical absence, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. This is where Samantha Markle's voice stops sounding like noise and starts sounding like a map. Because the sequence, the elevation, the deployment, the disappearance had already been outlined. Not once, not casually, but repeatedly over years, while the focus stayed locked on dismissing the source instead of examining the structure. And once that structure starts to reveal itself, everything else begins to align around it in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like design. Then comes the moment where the outside confirmation arrives, not from speculation, not from commentary, but from someone whose entire reputation is built on dismantling carefully managed narratives. Tom Bower doesn't enter quietly. Tom Bower doesn't speculate loosely. When Tom Bower speaks, it lands with weight because every statement carries the implication of evidence behind it. And when Tom Bower turned toward Harry and Meghan, the reaction wasn't defensive, it was silent. No lawsuits, no aggressive pushback, no attempt to shut it down in the way other stories had been handled. That's silence again. And then the statement that reframed everything, that Samantha Markle had been right, not partially, not selectively, completely. That single confirmation didn't just validate past claims, it forced a reevaluation of the entire timeline. Because if the dismissed voice had been accurate, then every ignored detail detail becomes relevant again, every contradiction becomes a clue, and every silence becomes intentional. Inside that realization sits another layer that feels even more unsettling, the position Harry occupied within it. Because from the outside, it's easy to assign blame, to simplify, to reduce everything to poor decisions or miscalculations. But the picture that starts forming suggests something more complicated. A structure built in spaces that weren't visible, decisions made in areas that didn't appear obvious, dynamics that existed beyond what was being openly presented. And if that's true, then the reality Harry experienced may have been fundamentally different from the one being constructed around him. Which brings everything back to that meeting. High Rove, a location chosen for privacy, for control, for containment, no cameras, no images, just confirmation. King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince Harry, Meghan Markle. Archie, Lilith names placed carefully into a statement that revealed just enough and nothing more. William absent. That absence not explained, but deeply felt, because it signaled that this wasn't a full reconciliation. It wasn't a restoration. It was something narrower, more specific, a grandfather meeting grandchildren. And when viewed through that lens, the timing shifts again, because this wasn't just about emotion. It was about access, about leverage, about a point where holding back no longer served the same purpose it once did. Samantha Markle had described that exact turning point, the moment when the balance changes, when the cost of distance outweighs the benefit of control. And suddenly, that prediction wasn't theoretical anymore. It had happened. The palace confirmed it because it couldn't be contained. The structure adapted because it had to. And the narrative adjusted just enough to accommodate the shift without fully explaining it. That's how controlled systems survive exposure, not by denying reality, but by reshaping how it's presented. Now, everything sits in a different light. The image that started it, the roles that were hidden, the movements that weren't explained, the departures that went unacknowledged, the silence that followed. Each piece on its own felt isolated. Together, they formed something far more cohesive and far more difficult to dismiss.